The mother of all bombs. Just hearing this name is enough to make anyone shudder. After all, this isn't just another weapon in the US military arsenal. It's a terrifying force of destruction, one of the deadliest bombs ever built. There are nations around the world that are well aware of its power. They know what happens when this bomb drops. They've seen it. But for Iran, the fear cuts even deeper. Why? Why is Iran in particular terrified of this bomb? What is it about this monstrous weapon that keeps Iranian leaders awake at night? Keep watching to find out. The fear surrounding this bomb isn't just about its name, it's rooted in its raw power. While it's referred to as the mother of all bombs, that isn't the device's official name. It's officially known as the GBU-43B Massive Ordnance Air Blast, or simply the MOAB. Doesn't quite have the same punch, does it? Well, the ominous nickname actually came from Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, who once spoke of the mother of all battles during the Gulf War. But now the US military has taken that phrase and bomb technology to a whole new level. So what is the mother of all bombs? The MOAB is a large-yield bomb developed by Albert L. Weimortz Jr. from the Air Force Research Laboratory. Despite what its name might suggest, the MOAB isn't a nuclear device, which is crucial to understand. Why? Well, because MOAB is frequently lumped together with nuclear weapons whenever there's talk about the destructive power of these devices. This misunderstanding has muddied discussions about the bomb's true purpose, which we'll talk about later in the video. While the effect of the MOAB might seem nuclear in scale, this bomb is very much a conventional weapon. But what a weapon it is! This thing is a behemoth, 30 feet long, 22,600 pounds, and packed with 18,700 pounds of H6 explosive. These specs make it more than just a bomb. We're talking about a force of nature. And this isn't even the heaviest non-nuclear bomb in the US arsenal. That title belongs to the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, a truly colossal 30,000-pound bunker buster, designed to tear through hardened targets. But back to the MOAB. Its sheer size isn't the only thing that's impressive about this bomb. Its explosive power is also staggering. The MOAB uses H6 explosives, originally developed for underwater blasts because it's shock-resistant and stable. And let us tell you, this bomb is packed with explosives. In fact, it carries the largest amount of explosive in any non-nuclear weapon in the US military inventory. To put that into perspective, compare it to the Joint Direct Attack Munition, JDAM, a frequently used precision-guided bomb. The JDAM weighs between 500 and 2,000 pounds and carries only a fraction of the explosive power found in the MOAB. The difference between the two is almost shocking. The JDAM can cripple a target severely, but the MOAB, it can wipe it off the map entirely. Now, this comparison between the JDAM and MOAB might seem odd, but this is only due to the misconception that the MOAB is a so-called dumb bomb, lacking precision and guidance. And sure, there were reports of the bomb being deployed by kicking it out of the back door of the MC-130 aircraft, which might make it sound like a crude barrel bomb approach. But that's far from reality. The MOAB is actually a guided munition. After it's dropped from the cargo doors of an MC-130 transport plane, a parachute deploys, slowing its descent. Then, the weapon detaches from the pallet and GPS satellite guidance kicks in. The MOAB is guided to a predetermined target by its onboard avionics, ensuring impressive accuracy. This is a far cry from the days of the so-called daisy cutter bombs, unguided bombs used in Vietnam that created massive blast zones without any precision. The MOAB, on the other hand, has it all: the explosive force and the accuracy of modern guidance systems. It's no longer about random devastation, it's about surgical, controlled destruction. The bomb is stabilized by 4 grid-like fins and glides to its target, ready to unleash its power at the exact location and the exact moment it's needed. But what are the locations targeted by the MOAB? Well, the MOAB is designed to strike certain types of targets, mostly located in hard-to-reach places. Think of underground facilities and deeply entrenched tunnel systems. However, this leads us to another common misconception about the MOAB, that it's a bunker buster. No, the MOAB isn't a penetrator, which means it won't drill through rock or hardened concrete. Instead, this device is an airburst weapon that detonates above the surface to maximize its destructive radius. This makes it ideal for softer or medium resilience targets like canyon floors, mountainsides, or the rugged hideouts that enemies might build deep within cave systems. Just imagine a bomb descending into a canyon or toward the mouth of a cave. When it explodes, it sends an immense pressure wave crashing into every crevice, engulfing anything and anyone within reach. Now, in terms of coverage, it's not quite the same as a high-altitude bomber mission. Heavy bombers like the B-52 or B-2 can cover far larger areas by dropping multiple smaller 500 to 2,000 pound bombs, thus blanketing a target. During the Vietnam War, for example, the US Air Force conducted over 10,000 of these bombing raids using B-52s. During a typical raid, 2 groups of 3 aircraft would drop around 168 tons of ordnance, raining terror on an area 1.5 by 0.5 miles. The explosive force of a single raid was equivalent to 10 to 17 MOABs. But the MOAB was never intended to replace those types of attack. It was always created for precision on a grand scale, delivering destruction over a focused area in one catastrophic blast, the kind that would be wasted on an open battlefield but devastating in enclosed environments. This brings us to another crucial use of the MOAB: psychological terror. You see, the MOAB's massive mushroom cloud mimics the notorious, haunting image of a nuclear detonation, a visual designed to shock and intimidate. During its development in 2003, which we'll also discuss in a bit, the MOAB was prepared as a psychological tool for potential use in Iraq, where the US intended to intimidate troops and break enemy morale. In this regard, the MOAB developers took cues from the infamous 15,000-pound BLU-82 bomb used in Vietnam and later in Afghanistan to devastating psychological effects. Seeing the impact the so-called daisy cutter had on terrifying adversaries, military strategists set out to create an even more powerful tool for psychological warfare, and they did just that. Seeing the MOAB in action, or even just hearing about it, can send a powerful message. It signals that any resistance will be met with an overwhelming show of force, and this is a message that Iran understands all too well. So the MOAB's very existence is enough to keep this country and its ilk on edge. After all, we're talking about more than a weapon. We're talking about a reminder of the potential scale of US military power and the readiness to deploy it whenever necessary. However, the horrors of the MOAB go well beyond the visual. Its primary effect is a massive blast wave, one said to stretch for up to a mile in every direction, generated by the bomb's staggering 18,700 pounds of TNT. But this isn't just a typical explosion. The bomb's thin aluminium casing maximizes the blast radius, allowing the force to extend over an enormous area instead of being confined by heavy metal that might limit its spread. When the MOAB detonates, an immense fireball erupts, causing immediate destruction, in another similarity with nuclear weapons. However, it's the pressure wave that delivers the MOAB's true devastation. As mentioned, the MOAB detonates above the ground, which allows its force to radiate across the surface. This approach maximizes the area affected, making it deadly for personnel in open areas and lethal, even for those in hardened defenses. Essentially, the pressure wave, fueled by high-temperature gases released in the blast, flattens everything in its path. For those caught within the blast radius, the injuries are particularly gruesome. The wave impacts gas-filled structures in the body, lungs, ears, and the gastrointestinal tract, causing internal injuries that can be fatal. Used against a cave system, the MOAB's pressure is even more sinister. It can cause tunnel collapse, trapping or killing those inside, and even if the tunnels hold, the wave can penetrate, injuring anyone within range simply by the sheer force of the shock. But how did this destructive device come to be? We've already mentioned that it was developed for potential use in the Iraq War, also referred to as the Second Gulf War. However, the bomb was never used in Iraq, serving instead as a looming threat, and for Iraq's next-door neighbor, Iran, the message was unmistakable. This weapon exists, and it's ready. The MOAB underwent its first test at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida in March 2003. The blast was downright shocking, a display of destructive power designed to unsettle anyone aware of its potential. Since 2003, at least 15 MOABs have been manufactured at the McAllister Army Ammunition Plant in Oklahoma. This figure lines up with the bomb's actual cost, which the US Air Force estimates at approximately $170,000 per unit. This relatively low price stems from using existing parts, materials, and an efficient in-house production process. While earlier reports had inflated the cost to as much as $16 million per bomb, this figure was widely misreported and didn't reflect the streamlined methods used to create the MOAB. Truthfully, the first MOABs were built as a crash project meant to meet urgent demand. That's why they sidestepped standard procurement and research costs. Today, manufacturing costs are much higher. With older parts unavailable and factoring in inflation, building more MOABs would require fresh design efforts and rigorous testing, making this bomb not only rare but extremely expensive to reproduce. As a result, it's unlikely we'll see this bomb used frequently, making each deployment a high-stakes decision designed to command attention. Interestingly, this decision doesn't have to come from the President of the United States. Why? Because the MOAB isn't a nuclear weapon. In fact, the first and only time the bomb was used, the strike wasn't directly authorized by the president at the time, Donald Trump. When asked if he personally authorized the strike, Trump responded, "Everybody knows exactly what happened. What I do is authorize my military. We have the greatest military in the world, and they've done a job as usual. We've given them total authorization, and that's what they're doing, and frankly, that's why we've been so successful lately." Though Trump didn't directly say whether he signed off on the specific use of the MOAB or not, his comments make it abundantly clear that the decision didn't necessarily require his direct approval. A senior administration official further clarified, "We don't approve every strike," noting that the Trump administration had moved away from micromanaging military strategy. Trump was also the one who pushed for this shift, granting military leaders more independence. That's why the first use of MOAB was reportedly approved by General John Nicholson, the commander of US forces in Afghanistan, after receiving the green light from General Joseph Votel, the commander of US Central Command at the time. But what is this first and only use of the MOAB we keep mentioning? The first time the MOAB was used in combat was in 2017 against another one of Iran's neighbors, Afghanistan. The target, a vast network of tunnels used by the Islamic State, Khorasan province, ISIS-K, had become a major threat to both US and Afghan forces in the region. These tunnels, which had originally been built by the CIA in the 1980s for the Mujahideen, were a significant advantage for ISIS-K, allowing them to stay hidden, plan, and strike unexpectedly. Since the Islamic State's Khorasan branch established its stronghold near the Afghan-Pakistani border, it was incredibly difficult for ground forces to control the terrain and neutralize the threat. The Afghan National Army Commando Corps tried for months on end, but the ISIS-K remained entrenched in the rugged, heavily fortified terrain, often using improvised explosive devices to slow progress. Prior to the explosion, Afghan forces had struggled to penetrate the area for weeks. Traditional approaches were essentially useless due to the region's difficult-to-access geography. However, even airstrikes and drones had been unsuccessful in taking out these fortified hideouts, so eventually, the US military turned to its ultimate weapon at the time, the MOAB. The mother of all bombs was dropped on the rugged mountains of Achin district, Nangarhar province, on April 13th at exactly 7:32 p.m. local time from the rear cargo door of an MC-130. The explosion was unlike anything most had ever witnessed. Afghan residents nearby reported feeling the earth shake as if an earthquake had struck. This is precisely how an Afghan soldier driving toward the targeted area described it, saying, "The explosion felt like a big earthquake, even in the surrounding districts." The blast itself was so powerful that it lit up the sky with a massive fireball, and the ensuing mushroom cloud could be seen for miles. As for the sound, the locals described it as the biggest blast they'd ever heard. One local man recounted, "I've grown up in the war, and I've heard several kinds of explosions through 30 years, suicide attacks, earthquakes, different kinds of blasts. I've never heard anything like this." Now remember how we said that ISIS-K became a threat to Afghan soldiers as well? Well, the Afghan troops were actually in on the strike, working closely with US Special Forces to ensure its precision and effectiveness. Local tribe elders were also warned to evacuate civilians ahead of time to minimize any collateral damage. Essentially, the MOAB strike was a joint effort between the US and Afghan forces, who also moved in to clear the area together in the aftermath of the explosion. But what was the aftermath of the explosion? Well, for one, the system of tunnels and caves used by ISIS fighters to move around freely and target US military advisors and Afghan forces in the area, as Trump's spokesman Sean Spicer put it, was obliterated. This was of the utmost importance, as defeating ISIS, according to Spicer, meant denying it operational space. And that's what the MOAB did. The MOAB also took out the ISIS militants hiding in the tunnels. Now, after the massive explosion, casualty reports were a bit of a moving target, with figures increasing over time as more information came in. On one side, the Afghan army proudly reported that 94 ISIS-K militants were killed, including 4 high-ranking commanders, with no signs of civilian casualties. This was, of course, the official narrative from the Afghan army, which has every incentive to downplay civilian loss. However, the situation wasn't so cut and dry. On the other side, a local Afghan parliamentarian, Esmatullah Shinwari, painted a different picture. Locals, he claimed, reported the tragic death of a teacher and his young son, both caught in the blast's wave. Residential buildings as far as 1.5 miles away also suffered damage from the blast. As the days went on, more casualties were reported, with the total climbing to 96 ISIS-K militants by April 18th. Among them, as it turned out, were 13 major commanders. According to the Afghan Defense Ministry, several foreign nationals, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Filipino militants were also killed. However, ISIS wasn't buying this story. The ISIS-affiliated Amaq news agency flatly denied that any militants were killed in the strike, a clear indication that they weren't about to give the US military any PR wins. So let's say the true toll of the MOAB explosion remains a bit murky, caught between military reports, local accounts, and the larger-than-life scale of the blast. One thing was still pretty clear though: the MOAB sent a message, and everyone in the region felt it, Iran included. That's probably why just a few months later, in September 2017, Iran started claiming that it had developed the father of all bombs. Iran's 10-ton bomb was being presented as the country's answer to the MOAB, just as devastating, just as destructive. General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, the commander of Iran's airspace force, bragged that this bomb could be launched from aircraft and had immense destructive potential. But here's the kicker: Iran wasn't the only one trying to match the MOAB's power in a desperate attempt to conceal their fear. About a decade prior, in 2007, Russia had also unveiled its own father of all bombs. This bomb was being billed as 4 times more powerful than the MOAB, thanks to its thermobaric design, which creates a deadly vacuum after detonation. This vacuum pulls air out of the target, making it particularly deadly in confined spaces like tunnels or bunkers. It was Russia's way of saying, "We can do it bigger." So, like Iran, Russia wasn't focused on practical application, it was just sending a message. However, the US military knows a thing or two about sending a bone-chilling message, one that resounds long after the dust settles. That's why Iran is so terrified of the mother of all bombs. The MOAB is a bit of a dramatic flourish. It isn't the first bomb you drop, it's the grand finale. It's the ultimate statement that says, "There's no place to hide." But before this statement comes, the US has sent lots of smaller messages that are just as direct. Take the B-2 bomber strikes in Yemen as an example. In 2024, US B-2 bombers targeted underground Houthi weapons storage sites, sending a message that only that stealth bomber could. The B-2's long-range strikes aim to dismantle the Houthi threat in Yemen and demonstrate a potent form of deterrence: America's ability to hit deeply buried, hardened sites anywhere in the world, no matter how well protected they are. These strikes were a reminder of US dominance in military technology, specifically highlighting the penetrating power of its munitions, which can destroy some of the most reinforced bunkers in existence. Now, you might wonder, how is targeting Yemen sending a message to Iran? Well, you see, Iran has long supported Houthi militants in Yemen, using them as a proxy in its ongoing rivalry with US interests in the region. The Houthis, with their underground bunkers and fortified positions, represent the kind of threat Iran could pose if tensions with the US were to escalate. The same goes for other Iranian proxies in the region, groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Shiite militias in Iraq. By demonstrating its ability to obliterate such underground networks in Yemen, the US is essentially drawing a direct line to Iran. Escalate and we'll target your fortified positions, no matter where you hide them. Of course, this is a major issue for Iran, as the country's nuclear and missile programs heavily depend on underground facilities. Now, the MOAB might not be able to penetrate facilities like the Fordow Fuel Enrichment Plant and Natanz Enrichment Complex, buried deep within mountains. However, the sheer scale and destructive power of this bomb can obliterate everything that lies above the ground, leaving no stone unturned. It can also create a massive shockwave that would disrupt critical communications, military operations, and infrastructure within a large radius, weakening Iran's ability to maintain control over its defensive systems. The MOAB's power can also incapacitate entire command centers and missile launch sites, which are dispersed across the country. This makes it an extremely effective tool against Iran's surface-level military assets, which are often the first line of defense for its more strategically critical underground facilities. The threat of such a devastating strike would also have a paralyzing effect on Iranian decision-makers. They have been panicking for a while now, trying to engage with other countries in the Middle East to secure support for their regime. Iran's leadership knows that if its fortified missile silos and nuclear sites are targeted, this could be the end of the country's nuclear program as it stands. And this is precisely what the US wants. You see, the US has repeatedly stated that it intends to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear arsenal. With Iran's breakout time, the period it would take to accumulate enough fissile material for a nuclear bomb, now reduced to a matter of weeks, the threat is even more immediate. The MOAB could serve as a powerful deterrent to this very scenario. It would signal to Iran that any further steps toward nuclear escalation could provoke the full force of US military capabilities. This full force, of course, includes the massive ordnance penetrator, which would have no issues obliterating facilities like Fordow or Natanz. However, even the MOAB alone could cause quite the amount of damage. Unlike what happened in Afghanistan in 2017, the US wouldn't exactly have the luxury of choosing isolated targets devoid of civilian presence. Iran's strategic facilities are often located near populated areas, and the deployment of MOAB in such contexts would undoubtedly impact nearby civilian infrastructure and, of course, the civilians themselves. This reality amplifies the bomb's psychological impact, which is also one of its key purposes. The MOAB wouldn't be used solely to cause physical destruction. It's intended to instill a sense of vulnerability into the heart of Iran's defensive posture. And if just the thought of this explosion already has Iran scrambling to consider other options, then its actual deployment would shake Tehran's strategic calculations to the core. But what do you think? Will this explosion eventually take place? And if it does, will it truly shift Iran's defensive posture? Or will it only deepen its resolve? Share your predictions in the comments section below. Now go and check out "This is how the US plans to destroy Iran's underground bunkers," or click this other video instead.